Thanks, everybody. I might just get everybody to take their seats, please. Thanks, everybody. Well, thank you, and welcome to our afternoon plenary session, which is going to be full of very interesting, practical, and very useful knowledge and research and discussion. But just a few things. I think fantastic to see everybody talking, collaborating. I've tried to go to as many sessions yesterday and today as possible, and I think everybody's doing a great job. And the way that I'm measuring that is by the level of enthusiasm in the room, the level of conversations, the questions, the quality of the presentation. So please keep that all up. And I just think, again, that what I said yesterday, we're all working together, we can really do great things, and that's what I'm seeing, and that's what I'm hearing the feedback. I'm hearing people go, oh, I didn't know about that research, or yeah, I knew about that. That we can make use of that. That's already having some great impact, and it's really great to see. So well done to everybody in that respect. And so this afternoon we're going to do two panel sessions. Firstly, because the work of this the UNE team with the Australian Disaster Resilience Index and the report, which I hope you all have a copy of, whether or not you've been on your phones and downloaded it or you've picked up a hard copy at the registration desk there, that you've familiarised yourself and you're ready to ask exact questions of Melissa Parsons here, who is ready to answer, and also autograph copies I've confirmed with Mel there as well. And so we'll welcome Mel up very shortly, as well as Jill Charker from NEMA to talk about ADRI and dive a bit deeper than what we were able to yesterday to get into some of the key results. And then we're going to switch gears. And one of the things that we try to do in these forums too is to bring different perspectives, and we hope to do that from an international perspective this afternoon, bringing some of our international delegates to the floor. And being able to provide some knowledge and exchange around collaborations more internationally there as well, and their views on the same challenges that really we're all facing in terms of global complexities, uncertainties, and the worsening natural hazard risks that we face globally as well. So that'll be a really great conversation, and I'll get those speakers up in just a little while also. But so yeah, to kick off, and to introduce the results out of the State of State of Disaster Resilience report, I'm going to welcome Associate Professor Melissa Parsons. You were introduced yesterday, so I'm not going to go back through your bio, but yes, you've done some fantastic work, and welcome you up to present it.
Thanks for the invitation to be here today and to introduce ADRI2. Now, as I said yesterday, if you were here, there have been many people who have contributed to the development of ADRI over the last decade or so that it's been going. And I do still extend my very heartfelt thanks to everyone who has walked alongside this ADRI project. Today, I'm just going to give you an overview of the Australian Disaster Resilience Index 2 and take you through the findings of the ADRI2, as we've been calling it. So for those of you who are not familiar with ADRI, now I'm assuming that some of you in the room are, but not everyone may be, so I'm just going to take a little time to give you a bit of the background to this. So ADRI models a system of broad structural settings that support disaster resilience. And we said in this model that disaster resilience is the capacity of communities to cope with natural hazard events, but also to learn, adapt and transform towards resilience. And this idea of the latent broad structural system of disaster resilience is important because ADRI assesses capacity for disaster resilience in that system, not the actual realisation of disaster resilience locally or for an individual following any one event. So it sits really within that systems space. So our model of that broad structural system of disaster resilience says that it's made up of those 8 dimensions there in the orange. Social character is the demographic characteristics of the community. Economic capital is the economic characteristics of the community. Emergency services is the presence and resourcing of emergency services. Planning and the built environment is the presence of legislation, plans, structures or codes to protect communities. Community capital is the cohesion and connectedness of the community. Information access is the potential for communities to engage with natural hazard information, largely through digital means. Social and community engagement is part of that adaptive capacity level, and that is the capacity within communities to adaptively learn and transform in the face of complex change. And then governance and leadership is the capacity within organisations to adaptively learn, review and adjust policies and procedures, or to transform organisational practices. And we collect data on each of those dimensions and then analyse that as a sequence of composite indexes. And there are 11 indexes overall. ADRI was developed over a 5-year research project and first released in 2020 via this interactive dashboard. And while the indexes have a life of about 7 to 10 years, because they're made up of broad structural dimensions that don't change quickly, it was a good time to recompute ADRI with updated data sets because it had been around about 7 years since we first did this research work. Now, we didn't change the model or the statistical methods of index calculation, so ADRI 1 is methodologically compatible with ADRI 2. Now, all of that new analysis was done in 2024, and ADRI 2 is now available on the dashboard, and the address is up there if you'd like to take a look. ADRI can be and is being used for all kinds of planning, policy, development, risk analysis and research work, and there's been over 65,000 unique views of the website since its launch, and over 600 user accounts have been created. But one of the things that we use the ADRI index for is to undertake an assessment of disaster resilience. So how do those indexes look around Australia and what do they mean? So this map shows the capacity for disaster resilience in each of 2,330 SA2s across Australia. Higher index values represent greater capacity for disaster resilience, so the green colours, and lower index values represent lower capacity for disaster resilience, so the purple colours. And we divide that into 3 bands of high, moderate and low. 25% of Australia's population, or about 6.5 million people, live in an SA2 assessed as having high capacity for disaster resilience. So these areas have an enhanced capacity to use available resources to cope with adverse events and to adjust to change through learning, adaptation and transformation. 52% of Australia's population, or about 13.5 million people, live in an SA2 assessed as having moderate capacity for disaster resilience. So these areas have some capacity to use available resources to cope with adverse events or to learn, adapt and transform. And these areas are kind of middle ground in terms of economic capital, access to a whole lot of different services and the provision of those services. Middle ground in terms of community characteristics and settings that enable learning and problem solving. And then 23% of Australia's population, or about 5.9 million people, live in an SA2 assessed as having low capacity for disaster resilience. And so these areas are limited in their abilities to use available resources, to cope with adverse events, or to be able to adjust to complex change. And that might be contributed through entrenched social and economic disadvantage, less access to services, and limited opportunities for adaptive learning and problem solving, as we've defined those things in our model. And there is a very distinct relationship between capacity for disaster resilience and remoteness. So the SA2s with moderate capacity are predominantly in metropolitan, inner-regional and outer regional areas, covering about 10% of Australia's land area. Most of those SA2s with that high capacity for disaster resilience are located within metropolitan and inner regional areas, all crammed in to less than 2% of Australia's land area. And the SA2s with low capacity for disaster resilience are generally in outer regional, remote and very remote areas. And these make up 87% of Australia's land area. Now, there are clusters of SA2s with low capacity for disaster resilience in metropolitan and inner regional areas, but these usually sit right next to or in very close proximity to areas of higher capacity. Remember, that's all within that 2% of Australia's land area. And in remote areas, on the other hand, low capacity for disaster resilience joins up to make these really large contiguous patches. So this is the coping and adaptive capacity level of the index. Now visually, there is a general pattern of higher coping and adaptive capacity along the eastern state coastal fringes. And about 66% of Australia's population, or 17.1 million people, live in an SA2 assessed as having some combination of either high or moderate coping and high or moderate adaptive capacity. So those two things together are the ways that you can cope with and then adapt to events. So the remaining 34% of the population live in SA2s assessed as having some combination of low coping and or low adaptive capacity. And again, there's a geographic pattern here. Most of the areas with low coping or adaptive capacity are in those outer regional, remote or very remote parts of Australia. So I realise that many people will want to know the difference between ADRI1 and ADRI2. And I have to say that we advise against comparing ADRI1 and ADRI2 data for SA2s at this stage, because we need to do further longitudinal data analysis to attribute directionality and significance of change, and to account for a whole lot of data factors that have changed between ADRI1 and ADRI2, including the boundaries of SA2s and post-COVID demography. But what I can talk about for now is the proportions of the population in high, moderate and low bands of disaster resilience. So the proportion of the population in areas assessed as having moderate capacity for disaster resilience hasn't changed. But the proportion of the population in areas assessed as having low disaster resilience has increased, while the proportion of the population in areas assessed as having high disaster resilience has decreased. And although this is tempered with a lot of caution here as a researcher and a researcher disclaimer, I would say that that's not the direction that we would like this structural system of disaster resilience to be going in. And you know, I do go back to that disclaimer. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to kind of think about here what's changed to what, why it's changed, and where it is, and we're hoping to be able to do some of that. But in the meantime, ADRI2 is a standalone picture of disaster resilience. It does use updated data that's gone into that model. So it is the current picture of the state of disaster resilience in Australia, still with those very important uses across policy, planning, risk assessment, and I think Jill's going to talk about some of those. Thanks very much.
And as you can hear already, and we spoke about a little bit yesterday, that ADRI 1 has been very, very impactful, and we hope that ADRI 2 is equally, if not more, impactful. And one of the main reasons why we decided to upgrade ADRI 2 was the want and the need from NEMA to use an updated ADRI as well. So it's very fitting that we partnered with NEMA to update ADRI. But I would like to now introduce Dr. Jill Charker, who will be familiar to many of you in her role as Deputy Coordinator General of the National Emergency Management Agency. And Jill has a long history of public policy in the Commonwealth in a variety of very senior executive roles, and we're really privileged to have you here with us, Jill, to talk about the application of ADRI. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Great to be here. Thanks so much, Andrew, for the kind introduction. So I'm coming here to this session this afternoon, as discussed, with a policy hat on. Clearly, I'm a public servant. I work for NEMA, but have got, I suppose, a set of responsibilities at the moment which spans NEMA's funding programs in recovery and resilience, as well as NEMA's policy functions around insurance, insurance as it pertains to natural hazard and the impact there, as well as the Sendai framework, the second National Action Plan, and some other functions. And so when I sit here and it's been great over the last day and a half already, listening to so much of the research and the innovation that is happening that this forum is highlighting, it gives people like myself enormous hope and encouragement that there is this tremendous pipeline of knowledge and insights that is being fed through into what is increasingly an incredibly difficult area, that being disaster management. We know, then we've been discussing already in the last day and a half, that globally our climate and weather patterns are changing. We've experienced, increasingly we're seeing predictive models of hazards being increasingly off the mark, not conforming with modelled predictions. And we've seen in our work, and we see this in NEMA and any of the state emergency management agencies would see this all the time, that our traditional expectations around so-called higher and lower risk periods or seasonal periods of weather in Australia no longer fit. So we have this notion that we often talk about in NEMA of the higher risk weather season notionally between October and April, and of course weather events increasingly don't occur just in that window. We are also seeing year-on-year challenges. We're seeing disaster management costs continuing to rise. I see that very sharply at the national level, particularly around the recovery funding programs that NEMA administers, but of course it is not just there, it is across the board. We're seeing resources across all levels of government further stretched. We are facing a relatively uncertain future, as many of the presentations that I've heard already in the last day or two have highlighted. It's getting increasingly hard to plan and prepare for that future. And I think it's fair to say on any measure, the impact and scale of disasters, not just in Australia but globally, are increasing. If we just look at the last higher risk weather season, which notionally commenced in September 2024 and notionally concluded at the end of April this year, nationally we saw around 93 LGAs in this country activated at least once, 59 twice, 20 activated 3 times, so the same local government area, 3 lots of disaster event activations just in that season, and 2 LGAs 4 times. So the distribution of the impact is both broad and narrow and deep in aspects of our country. And of course, even as recently as last month, we've continued to see the effects of the severe weather in New South Wales, which has in turn flowed into other parts of Australia as well. So things are not slowing down, they're ramping up. And from a policy point of view, when we look at the system, particularly nationally, we're seeing cascading, compounding complex events that we've talked about to date, resulting in those multiple activations. We're resulting in an almost permanent state of response and recovery. And certainly those LGAs which have had those multiple activations, not just this season, but in seasons past, will say very readily that they can barely recover from a previous event before being thrust into another one. We're seeing insurance losses of over $20 billion since the 1920 Black Summer bushfires. We're seeing a government recovery reconstruction program of around, well, I was going to say 24 billion. Brendan Moon, my boss, said 24 billion yesterday. He also gave a commitment I'd give you an updated number today. I don't have the updated number, but it's going to be well north, unfortunately, of 24 billion based on the last season. It's getting higher, and that's just in government-funded recovery and reconstruction. That does not go to a range of other recovery needs, of course, which are relevant. And we're seeing Deloitte's estimated costs of 38 billion per annum. They were forecasting 73 billion by 2060. Now, 5 years ago, those cost forecasts were half of that, 5 years ago. So, having set that reality, it brings on the need to look at how we need to do things differently, and particularly look at the choices and the changes that we may need to make, even if they are difficult, which they are. And this goes directly then to how governments think about policy and what settings are needed to achieve what outcomes in disaster management. And that's disaster management end to end across the continuum. It's not just response, it's not just reconstruction, it is across the continuum. If we think end to end, what changes need to be made to our systems? Many of you will be aware of the Colvin Review. So this was a recent federal government commissioned review into Commonwealth disaster funding. It was led by Andrew Colvin, who's a former AFP commissioner, and a team when he was working at Deloitte. We just tend to call it the Colvin Review because it's an awfully lot quicker than spelling out the whole title. That review was launched publicly in October last year. So if you've not read it, it is on NEMA's website. You're most welcome to have a read. But broadly speaking, the review found that Australia's disaster management frameworks and arrangements have not evolved at the same rate as the changing nature of disasters themselves. And as Brendan outlined yesterday in his keynote session, that review called for changes and it identified opportunities to reform emergency management. Colvin had a number of recommendations across a number of themes, but three key themes he called out were the need to set clear outcomes for investment, that at the moment there's a lack of a clear articulated outcomes framework. So when a government, Australian or otherwise, invests in something in disaster management, be it response, be it recovery, there's no clear outcomes framework that says these are the outcomes and the measures by which we will evaluate whether that investment is hitting the mark. He also called out the need to better use evidence and risk information. And he also called out, consequently, the need to reform funding programs accordingly and in line with outcomes and evidence information. So honing in on the evidence and risk piece, the question is then what tools, what evidence and information can we draw on to help us move towards a disaster management system which is more fit for purpose, importantly, not just for our current environment, but also our future context, which we know will continue to change as well. And this is where tools like ADRI2 come into play. This is also where we need to have a stronger understanding of natural hazard risk. This is where investment needs to be more targeted to risk and where we need to be clear again about the outcomes that that investment is designed to achieve, and we need to track and measure them so we can change accordingly. On risk, Brendan and Paul Gloyne, Paul is NEMA's Chief Data Officer, yesterday both touched on the work that we're doing in NEMA to try to build a national natural hazard risk profile. Now, this is a new tool we're developing. We're only developing it as a minimum viable product, meaning just sort of the first iteration of it in the first instance. Why are we doing it? Because there is currently no consistent approach across the nation to understanding and quantifying natural hazard risk in Australia. There are absolutely efforts across the nation to do things locally, sometimes at state level, sometimes at local level. Nationally and consistently, there is not. We have no nationwide picture. So what the tool will do is combine an understanding of hazard, exposure and vulnerability using catastrophe loss modelling methodology. Now that's a methodology used in a very standard manner by the insurance sector. It enables you effectively to monetise loss or impact. In the case of the insurance, of course, it relates to insurance losses or insurable losses. So we're using that very standard modelling methodology, which is consistent with what other countries like the US and others have used for a long time, to produce an understanding of risk, which then can then be quantified in dollar terms. And we're producing a measure called AAI, or Average Annual Impact, and that's a derivation of average annual loss, which is the insurance-based method metric that many of you would know about. And that tool will start to give us, as policymakers in all tiers of government, an ability to identify the locations that are the highest or at the highest risks of disaster based on that combination of their hazard exposure and vulnerability impacts. We can also potentially think about using the financial metrics or estimates produced by that tool as a tangible metric for cost savings. And as many of you will appreciate in government, the need for cost-benefit analysis, the need to track investment, is critical, often as a project success indicator in the context particularly here of risk mitigation or project evaluation. So now let's take ADRI2. Incorporating ADRI2 then into our understanding of risk from the risk profile that I just touched on will allow us to further refine those identified high-risk local government areas based on communities' resilience and capacity to respond to disasters, recognising areas that have a greater need for resilience initiatives. So it's starting to set us up to do a more layered, more sophisticated analysis to enable policymakers and governments to take a more targeted and hopefully equitable allocation of resources, and ultimately ensuring that communities of greatest need and support are prioritised. So for example, to put this into practice, an LGA which say has a high risk, natural hazard risk, which is that combination of hazard exposure vulnerability as measured through the risk profile, and low resilience as measured through ADRI2, is likely to be requiring much more intense and urgent intervention. In contrast, areas that have low natural hazard risk but also low resilience may not be prioritised as highly immediately in the short term, but should or could still be considered in the mid or long term. So it starts to give you a way to sort through where do you invest. So if, for example, a policymaker were trying to shape, let's say, a hypothetical program looking at the human and social impacts of a disaster, and I stress human and social, not infrastructure in this example, we might see a scenario like this, where Brisbane, for example, is considered to have a high flood event impact when you express that in monetised loss terms. Lots of infrastructure, lots of buildings, lots of capacity for an awful lot of cost and loss in the event of a high flood impact event. But Brisbane is likely to be considered to be much more resilient when you take an ADRI view of community coping and adaptive capacity, and able to cope and adapt to disasters. It's got strong infrastructure, it's got capable emergency services, it's got high community awareness. So even though the flood risk might be high, the capacity to manage and recover from disasters is actually strong. In contrast, if we take Gympie, Gympie is a regional town, it's about 170 k's north of Brisbane. In terms of actual risk, it may have a lower flood impact in monetised loss terms, but it also has low resilience across multiple dimensions, which we can find out again through ADRI2. So again, hence, even though it is less exposed, it is more vulnerable to long-term impacts, even from more moderate disaster events. So given the policy outcomes required, which are a big driver here, so here I'm talking about human and social impact. If the policy outcomes were focused on infrastructure, it might produce a different set of solutions or recommendations. But here, in this example, investment might be better delivered into Gympie to lift community capacity to respond to future events, whilst in Brisbane, the focus might instead be on continuing to strengthen infrastructure, for example. So that's sort of a window as to how some of these tools can really be used to inform and prioritise investment. So tools like the ADRI, like the risk profile that we're working on, are actually really quite critical for policymakers at all levels of government, because they help us make decisions about how to allocate scarce resources. Resources are always scarce, but the reality is that for a government with many priorities, this issue is competing with health, education, defence, national security and other issues as well. And when we start talking in the disaster management space about something like risk reduction, where often it requires upfront or short-term investment, so a financial loss, if you like, early, without seeing a gain until many years later. And often that gain is expressed in terms of an avoided cost. So it's, again, another level of difficulty to measure. Tools and evidence to support that are invaluable. Are they always enough to get government to take a particular decision? Not necessarily. Logic is important, evidence is important, but there, as we all know, there are other political influences that operate. But in my view, it's an absolutely necessary prerequisite. It also importantly helps us, particularly tools like ADRI2 and risk profiles, help us mobilise support early and effectively. So whilst a lot of my discussion's been on investment, there is also a real role for tools like this coming further up the disaster continuum in response and recovery. So when you know ahead of time that there are particular characteristics of a community and that community is impacted by a disaster event, it enables you to target efforts into what's likely to be needed sooner by that community in a recovery context or a relief context as well. So NEMA is really excited to see the ongoing take-up of tools like ADRI2, and I hope ADRI3, 4, 5 and many more, by everyone in the disaster management community, and that's from first responders through to policymakers, ultimately to better support our decision-making and help us create an environment for Australians which, in the words of NHRA, is safer, more resilient and more sustainable. Thank you.
Now, yes, please join me in thanking both Mel and also Jill for that excellent presentation on ADRI. The key thing is that thanks to Johan, who's here in the second front row, ADRI2 is now available online, so you can go to the website and you can look at the data. Most importantly too, there's the API there, so if there's any organisations that are interested in accessing the full data set and incorporating that into your analysis, already some have been coming to me and saying, oh, you know, we're sorting it out with Mel and we're going to get it, etc. If you're not already having those conversations, please come up and have those conversations, contact the team and let's get you access to ADRI2 so you can start using it as well. But yes, thank you again to Mel and to Jill for your insights this afternoon. I'm now going to welcome up our other panel. So I'll just ask Mel and Jill just to take your seats and invite our other three panellists to the stage. Thank you. So our other panel this afternoon is really about creating other insights. So we're talking a lot about Australian-based research today and what we're doing here in Australia, what we're trying to foster here through the NHRA ecosystem and the work that we're doing. But it's really important that we're able to collaborate and bring in international perspectives, and that's really what we hope to do this afternoon through our discussion. And so we've been really fortunate that we've got three international delegates that have agreed to join us this afternoon for this to share their perspectives and their experiences. And we selected these three because they're quite unique in some ways. All three actually have some form of volcanology background, which you might think is actually a little bit weird. Why have we invited three folks that have some background in volcanology to the room? Well, actually, when we think about folks that are doing natural hazard research, that actually think about flooding, windstorms, fire, earthquakes, all the things that we're actually interested here in Australia. These guys think about those in a multi-hazard aspect all the time, because there are all the multi-hazard aspects to do with volcanology. So that's just one interesting thing that I'll share with everybody. But let's just run through. So firstly, we've got Dr. Richard Smith, who last night I introduced to Rob Webb as the Australian version of me, which Richard did just simply say, no, that's not the case. So whether or not that's positive or negative, I don't know, Richard. But Richard's actually does have a similar role in the sense that he's the director of New Zealand's Natural Hazards and Resilience Platform. Richard also sits on our International Advisory Committee, as well as Susanna. And we learn a lot from what Richard and his team have been doing over the last decade. Particularly as you move from the Resilient Science Challenge model to the platform model as well. And there's much that we'll continue to learn from Richard and his team. So it's great, Richard, that you've been able to join us this afternoon. Secondly, we've got distinguished Professor Christine Kenney, or Cassie, from Massey University in New Zealand. So thank you for coming. And Cassie's been with us really since day zero on Tuesday, joining our First Nations Network meeting out at the SafeCom office, and it has been really great to share and talking to Cassie over lunch, already talking about greater collaborations between our First Nations researchers here in Australia and researchers from Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. But Cassie's also the distinguished professor and the inaugural Professor of Disaster Risk Reduction at Massey University, and the Director of the Maori Disaster Risk Reduction Research Centre there. So thank you both, Richard and Cassie from Aotearoa. And now from Singapore, but also originally from, I think you did your PhD, oh no, not PhD, you did your PhD in Australia, but from Bristol, England. We're very welcome to welcome Susanna Jenkins, so Associate Professor Susanna Jenkins from NTU University in Singapore. So Susanna has actually a very distinguished background in volcanology, particularly about understanding risk. A lot of the things that Jill just spoke about, Susanna is a global, truly a global expert in, and so we're very lucky to have her on our International Advisory Committee also. So they are our three panellists that we're going to learn from today, and we sit in the distinguished shadow of. I've asked them all to provide sort of a 5 to 8 minute insight into their context, how they operate, some of the work that they are doing, so we can understand what they're doing, and then we can start to ask them some questions. So, Richard, I will ask you to go first, please. I think we've got some slides there for Richard. Oh no, sorry, just to confuse everybody, no slides for Richard.
Do you want us to be comfortable, or do
Well,
you want us
whatever
to...
you want.
Kia ora, kia ora.
You look comfortable.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and welcome everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity. The only disagreement with Andrew around the comparison yesterday was that I don't have the energy the frenetic energy of Andrew. I guess that was the point of difference there. I wanted to start with some acknowledgements to the NHRA team. It's been just actually a thrill the last couple of years working with the team, Andrew and Cheryl in particular, and really inspired by the approach that's been taken by the centre, and we're learning a lot from them in terms of the work we're doing to build the new platform in New Zealand. So I'll just touch briefly on kind of a context around the situation in New Zealand. I'm not sure how international New Zealand really is as a perspective when you're in Australia, so apologies for that. But we'll try and sort of draw out some themes. There's a lot of stuff that I think resonates with what we've already heard in the last day and a half or so. So yeah, as Andrew said, multi-hazard context, we have everything, everywhere, all at once, regularly damaging events. You would have seen probably Brendan Moon's presentation yesterday, a similar one we could show for New Zealand in terms of a series of cascading and coinciding events, not just earthquakes. We've had some major severe extreme weather events which have had really quite devastating impacts in communities, kind of approaching kind of a Katrina scale in the New Zealand context, people on roofs, being rescued, having to punch their way through their ceilings. That's been really quite confronting for New Zealanders just in the last couple of years. The emergency management sector, broadly similar in an Australian context, except we don't have the federal level, obviously, which can simplify things. A bunch of national agencies involved in support and lead functions for local government around emergency management, risk reduction, disaster resilience more generally. And I think the philosophy is broadly similar to Australia in the sense that the strategy is around the intent, at least in a whole of society approach. Whether we've achieved that or on the way to it, I guess, is a discussion point. And the ambition, I guess, to bring the community together and develop self-reliance, essentially as a component of coping and adaptive elements of resilience. I get a point of difference, and Cassie will be touching on this, I'm sure, is around the emerging opportunity around building strong partnership with Māori as key players, participants, decision makers in the emergency management system. That's a kind of an emerging opportunity. Our challenges, we're a small economy, small nation, very high exposure, as I said, limited geographic diversity. If there's a fault line and a floodplain and an unstable slope, we've built something on it. And so a hit in one area generally has national impacts. And so the threshold for a national emergency is pretty low in New Zealand. And we are, the last 10 years since the Kenney earthquake sequence in particular, we've had several national emergencies. Long legacy of building the wrong things in the wrong places, and we're dealing with that. Ageing infrastructure, historic underinvestment in those renewals, growing inequities. All of the uncertainty we've been hearing about from the futurists in the last couple of days. And while we've got a relatively simple governance environment, tends to be fragmented, and there's still lack of clarity about who's doing what, especially around risk reduction as opposed to response. And I guess there's a bigger issue, still the challenge more generally in disaster resilience, about how we, given that broader systemic issues that drive vulnerability, they're really the major determinants of holistic resilience. How do we get the disaster resilience context into the all of those other societal issues? In terms of emerging signals, briefly, there's a big focus at the moment on catastrophic risk, so recognition that we do have nation breaker type events that, if they are realised, will bring the government to its knees, so that we will not have parts of government that are able to function for some period of time. There's a recognition and a reality around that. And science has been driving, informing and quantifying what that could look like. And it's led to a whole program of catastrophe planning, as it's called. Very close connections between NEMA New Zealand and NEMA Australia around that work, partnering on things like the Alpine fault scenario. And this is relevant for Australia in the context that one of Australia's bad days could be an Alpine fault event in the peak of the ski season. Up to 60,000 Australians in July-August period over on the South Island ski slope. So, quite a significant impact for Australia in that sense. Where that all leads us to, I guess, is the need and the drive for research. And so we have this new platform that's emerging. Andrew's closely involved in that, and there's a really big opportunity ahead of us in terms of bringing work together and I think deriving value and reciprocity out of that. Elements of that related to Indigenous knowledge, Mātauranga Māori, and Cassie will be touching on that. But some themes around living with risks, the human behavioural science, broadly set of similar community issues, so how can we learn from each other rather than duplicating work and effort in that regard. Better resilience decisions is a theme, and really around land use planning and the built environment choices and the trade-offs we're making. And then next generation risk assessment, as we're calling it, so the quantification, better understanding hazard and risk, the impacts, what is it that we're actually preparing for, and to drive that quantification into treasury thinking, essentially decision-making at the highest level around the government balance sheet. And that's probably enough context for me. Thanks, Andrew.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Now, Cassie, you're welcome to stay or come up here. Okay, all good. And I'll just remind everybody too that we're using Slido this afternoon, so you can get in early and get your first question up. So
Andrew,
even better.
slides?
Yes, we'll get the slides up. Yep, all good.
Oh, that looks good. Well, good day, everybody. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko marama Kenney tōku ingoa. So you can see, even though I'm Cassie from Massey and I have a big, long academic label, I'm like a lot of my people. I have a lot of aliases, which are very useful when you're dealing with the cops. So I thought I'd start with this colonial picture of the 1886 eruption of Tarawera. You will see that there are possibly ancestors of mine standing there waving their hands in the air and looking very stressed. But was that really the reality? So this scary looking chap up here is the Māori prophet Te Koti, and he wears many hats. He's been finalised by historians as a prophet, a soothsayer, someone who speculates. But in reality, he was a really sophisticated natural scientist and an emergency manager. And as someone who was once a frontline responder myself, but too old now, not fit enough, I really appreciate that. So the word waiata refers to traditional songs. We're an oral culture. Te Koti was a master natural scientist, and what he did, I've been told by friendly volcanologists, is classic volcanic monitoring. And what he did was he put each line was classic volcanic monitoring assessment. One of them deals with changes to the soil. One of them deals with changes to the flora. That made him go and look and inspect volcanic vents. He took temperature readings using traditional methods. There were also areas where the small bodies of fluid on Tarawera at the time, and he went up and checked the temperatures there and looked at what the water was doing. Observational scientist, but he documented all of that in the waiata. He then took that waiata and he went and shared it with Māori communities around the mountain before it erupted. And ironically, the only communities went to are the ones that were eventually in the Ashfall region. So they didn't wave their hands in the air. There was a fair bit of movement because he was highly respected, and he acted as a really effective emergency manager communicating risk. And why a 19th century example? It's because there is treasure. There are diamonds in that old body of knowledge. So moving forward to contemporary times, as Richard alluded to, we've had an ambrosious salad of nasty events that range across earthquakes to volcanic eruptions to extreme weather events to floods. And Māori have been there in every single one, often drawing on Indigenous knowledge, but also drawing on cultural values and ways of working together that have several thousand years of history. So the effectiveness of these responses prompted a lot of interest from disaster sociologists like myself and some of my colleagues that are disaster economists and volcanologists and environmental scientists who are also all Māori. And we started looking at early work around looking at, what made these traditional systems so effective. And we worked with our colleagues, many of whom are in local government and also in frontline response agencies, the police, the fire service, and we started gathering that sort of documentation. At that time, we had what we call the Natural Hazards Platform. A lot of the CRIs were involved. We had the Earthquake Commission, and MB was just starting to fund. A few of us managed to get some government money to actually do proper research. And then more recently, along came the National Science Challenges and the Resilience to Natural Challenges Challenge, which ran for 10 years with 2 tranches, the last of which was run and managed beautifully by Richard, has led to where we are now, where Richard now leads the Natural Hazards and Resilience Platform. Along the way, Māori scientists, across all the disciplines, and Māori communities became part of the story. And they also contributed to the National Resilience Strategy. So challenge research was directly put into that. And the things we learned along the way is that Māori hazard managed approaches, they rely on collective responsibility, authority, agency, so the ability to make decisions and actions. They're extremely effective at looking after Māori, but not just Māori, wider community disaster resilience. So we saw it in the Edgecumbe floods, where the Māori set up their own control centre and actually had emergency management qualified controllers who are Māori. We saw it following the Canterbury earthquakes, where the local tribe rolled out a massively significant response. We saw it following the eruption of Whakaari up in the Bay of Plenty in 2019, where we saw the local Māori community provide a huge amount of care, not only to those that were impacted, but that continued through the recovery period, where family members came back and needed to process their grief. And then you got the ones that didn't think twice about the fact that their house was minted. So the house in the bottom corner there with the big hole in the middle was from a boulder that rolled down the hill during the Canterbury earthquakes. And the family that lived there weren't there because as soon as the first quake struck, they were further down the hill on stable bedrock, firing up the kitchens because they knew our marae would become places where people would come evacuate to for safety. And that happened right around the country, and it's happened again and again and again. So our old knowledge, which encompasses histories of ways of being and seeing and understanding the world, is essential for informing contextualised disaster resilience planning in New Zealand. We've proven it again and again. And along the way, with various initiatives coming, we realised, us oldies, that there's a whole group of younger researchers that are coming through that actually are going to need a space where they can be Māori as well as scientists. And so in 2020, we went after getting a grant from what was EQC and is now Tokatuaki, New Zealand Natural Hazards Commission, with a view to establishing a Māori disaster research centre. And we were very effective with that. We've subsequently published extensively, funded a fair bit of research. Our affiliates number 60 plus. We have over 30 plus Māori graduates across risk science, environmental planning, environmental science, seismic engineering, volcanology, and they are all progressing. Some started as honours students and are now doing their PhDs, and they are giving back to their communities. But we are also bringing the communities with them. So we're actually providing small direct grants to communities to help build community practitioner, both research and emergency management practitioner capability. So somewhere along the line, we've now come to become the preeminent collective and incubator of Māori disaster researchers and practitioners, and about 99.9% of the researchers on the platform are all affiliated with the centre, which is really good. What's even better is that we have an older group of very senior Māori researchers right around the country, some involved in the platform, some not, from building infrastructure, from ecological science, from risk management, from architecture, and environmental planning have also all come on board. We've got representation from what are about to change. All of the Crown research agencies, all of the universities bar Otago, and we're in conversations with them, and also the two Māori universities. So there's a little link there to the website, which I'm not going to push on because I don't think we've got time. I suspect I've already talked for 5 minutes. So this was a research project. It's now evolved into an ongoing research program, and we're up into the seven-figure sort of funding space, which is really nice because we started on a shoestring with about 250,000. So we've got all of this amazing research, we've got all of this capability. Grassroots Māori operate when disasters occur, not just within their tribal regions, but across government, across local government, across central government, across frontline responders. And The relationships, and I've heard that talked about a lot today, are what trigger that, and they operate really, really rapidly. So to give an example, from the past with the Canterbury earthquakes, it took 15 minutes to establish a national Māori disaster recovery network that included most iwi and Māori representation across all the frontline responders. So you'd think there'd be some sort of legislation. We have had successive government reports that have all said the same thing, that Māori need to be included in local governance, in emergency management, and also have a voice at national level. It needs to be legislated. And there are other reasons that it might be useful. A pragmatist would say that collectively Māori contribute 127 billion per year to the GDP. We hold 82 billion of assets and we're not going anywhere. It makes sense to have the largest private collective in the country at the table when you're resilience planning for a nation. But there is resistance. So these are some comments from a review of the Hawke's Bay Civil Defence and Emergency Management Group's response to Cyclone Gabriel. And they are recommending the same things. But when you look at the COVID pandemic, you look at the Nelson Tasman fires, the Kaikoura and Canterbury earthquakes, these reports have been saying the same thing for the long time and none of the recommendations have been implemented. There was an attempt. We had a ministerial advisory committee that developed a bill, made it all the way to select committee, it was stopped in its tracks. There is now a new consultation underway. The minister does recognise that Māori need a role, but we're a wee ways from getting there. So, with all the research that's been done to date, and there'll be many things on this little list that are familiar to Indigenous members of the audience, these are probably the key priorities for Māori communities, Māori scientists, Māori private sector actors in terms of what we require for disaster resilience in the country. I'm not going to read them all off because I think the little headings do that for you. Richard talked a little bit about the challenges that we face. I would add the political context into that mix. It is challenging for us at the moment, and different governments bring different political lenses. Certainly the geographical isolation, but I am heartened because with regard to recent disaster research conferences and upcoming ones this year, like the large APRU conference in the Philippines, like the International Disaster Risk Management Society's conference, which is a large European North American conference being held in Greece this year. Like, for those of you that have worked in health, if there's anyone here, the World Academy of Disaster Medicine have just had theirs. Culture and indigeneity and knowledges, that little menage a trois is coming more and more to the front. So there is going to be opportunities. And in fact, I'm delighted to say that my centre is looking forward to bi-monthly meetings with NIDA, our mob, their mob, coming together collectively. And I think that our Australian partners and our New Zealand partners have an incredible opportunity here. One more challenge, actually. I've just come back from the UN in Geneva, and funding constraints are coming down hard everywhere, not just in our neck of the woods. So talking with colleagues from the States, from England, from Europe, and Scandinavia, the restrictions on funding for research are also there. So anyone got any bright ideas? Te toi whakaruru hau, platform, we're all ears. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to echo Richard's comments about thank you for inviting us to this, and I've also really enjoyed this conference. It's the first time I've been to NHRF, and I'm really enjoying the mix between the academics and the practitioners and meeting lots of people across those spaces. So, as Andrew said, I'm coming here from Singapore. So I'm an academic, and I've been working in hazard and risk assessment, disaster risk reduction, and as Andrew said, most of my work today has been in volcanoes, and I'm very thankful that you prefaced exactly what I was going to say, that volcanoes are multi-hazard. So the work we do feeds into basically all of the hazards that we're seeing in Australia as well. I've been in Singapore now for nearly 10 years, but I have a very fond association with Australia. I did my PhD here about 20 years ago. My partner's Australian, my kid's Australian. I moved here about a year ago, so I actually spend my time now between Sydney and Singapore. And what I wanted to do now, on the assumption that many of the audience might not be as familiar with Singapore as you are with New Zealand, is give a bit of a background and context to the research landscape in Singapore. So to start with, Singapore's a little pink dot up at the base of Malaysia. We're actually about the same distance away from the Australian mainland as New Zealand is. We're a comparable population as well in size to New Zealand, and that's pretty much where the comparison ends. So we can fit a whole island of Singapore mostly within Lake Taupo in New Zealand. And as it turns out, you can also fit it within Adelaide. So this pink outline is the Singapore island. We're very small. And we're also very, therefore, densely populated. We're a city island state. We're mostly concrete. And that has its challenges. Luckily, like Australia, we're relatively geologically stable. So that's a good thing. We have very consistent weather as well. So if you ever look at the weather forecast for Singapore, it's 30 degrees, it's 70% humidity, and there's a chance of a thunderstorm every single day. And we're also very low-lying. Our highest point is about 137 meters above sea level. So that also comes with its own challenges. But while we're geologically relatively stable, we sit within an incredibly hazardous region. So we sit within 400 kilometers of the Ring of Fire, and that comes with the earthquakes, the volcanoes, the tsunami. And it's also that part of the Ring of Fire that passes through Southeast Asia is one of the most densely populated. And of course, those two things together give us a high propensity for disasters. And if you ever look at globally at the number and frequency of disasters, it is dominated by Southeast Asia. So we sit in a very hazardous and disaster-prone region. In Singapore, our greatest direct threat is really from climate change and weather extremes such as flash flooding and heat waves. But we're also exposed to transboundary impacts. So haze, for example, is a common impact. That's where the particulates from forest fire burning in Borneo or Sumatra reach Singapore and have effects on people for respiratory hazards. So EOS was actually founded in 2008 off the back of the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. So while the Boxing Day tsunami did not affect Singapore directly, it had a huge effect upon Singapore because there were a number of Singaporeans abroad, so tourists abroad impacted, and also because the medical repatriation of any expat tourists in the region was mostly to Singapore. So insurance was sending those medical repatriations to Singapore. And at that point, Singapore realized that actually they didn't really know much about the geohazards in the region. They'd been very focused on Singapore itself. There was, in fact, no geoscience degree available in Singapore. There is now, we've created it. But they really had no homegrown talent or expertise in this area. And so they founded EOS, the Earth Observatory of Singapore, with that knowledge, and they used the Earth Observatory of Singapore to set up the Asian School of the Environment, which is where we train our graduates in geoscience, and they feed off into Singaporean government. And this is what I really value about Singapore, is it has a very long-term vision. So politically, it's been called a flawed democracy, which means that we really don't have to worry about those 3 to 4 year or 3 to 5 year election cycles. Singapore can think very long term and very stably, and they do. And that's a fascinating research environment to be part of. Okay, well, the next slide. Yes, thank you. Not that slide, this slide. So EOS itself, and we're the research institute tasked with looking at geohazards and hazards in the region, has 4 main research pillars. So we're interested in climate, tectonics, volcano, and then the more applied risk in society. But we also have a number of foundations below that. So for example, the Center for Geohazard Observations puts in monitoring instruments in our region and helps to maintain them, works closely with our regional collaborators. The remote sensing lab uses synthetic aperture radar to map disaster impacts and to provide those to aid agencies so that they know where to provide aid. Community engagement works with schools in Singapore and schools in our region, and so on and so forth. We also have a very similar mission statement, which I quite enjoy. So sustainable, safer, resilience, all the same sort of things. We're aiming for the same things as the NHRA. Now, when I think about challenges that we face in Singapore, or maybe I'll start with like pluses. In Singapore, we're pretty well funded. EOS is actually in the second stage, so we're moving away from government block funding, but they're still kind of funding our research projects to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars, so we're still pretty lucky. And I think that's one of the challenges we don't face relative to many other places in the country, or in the world, rather. But the challenges we do have are that we're this tiny little city island state, so if we want to do anything about the hazards, we have limited space or availability to do that. When we're thinking about geohazards in our region, it's not like New Zealand or Aotearoa or Australia where you can monitor those directly. It's not our right to go into Indonesia or the Philippines or Malaysia and monitor their hazards. So we're very reliant on data from our counterparts, which means we have to build very strong, trusting relationships, which then feeds into the political side. And that can be challenging for us as scientists because sometimes the political side goes a little bit wrong and that affects us down at the science level. We also have, a very concreted environment. There's complexities associated with that. We're technologically reliant. Without our air conditioners, we would absolutely fall apart. And despite that, we're an aging infrastructure. So Singapore has come a long way in the 60 years that it's been independent, and our infrastructure is sort of starting to show that story. On the other side, it's a fascinating place to work because the people in the civil servant and the public service are amazing, phenomenal people. I really, really enjoy working with them. And there's a lot of digital initiatives and real forefront horizon scanning initiatives that are looking to the future to see how we can improve things in Singapore. So there's a lot of work on smart cities, for example, so using digital technology to improve life within cities. We also have, or are trying to have, regional leadership. So Singapore is in a quite, where you're a good thing, I can't remember the word, begins with P, it will come back to me. But basically we're privileged. We're in a privileged position where we have a lot of money. We're a very developed state in a area that is less developed with less money. Politically, we also perhaps throw our weight around sometimes in that way, which doesn't help. But it means we have the opportunities to really support and help our partners in the region. We are also a finance hub. So we have a lot of insurance companies within our borders, and we like to take advantage of that. And there's a lot of work at the moment in the buzzword of AI, as there is everywhere, but we're really trying to further that sort of space in computer science and how it can connect with hazard and risk. So in terms of, I was thinking about shared goals with Australia, and I think, we're all working in DRR, maybe in different circumstances. Sustainable development is of interest, and I think we have a shared interest in making sure our region is safe, resilient, and sustainable. There have been initiatives to date between Singapore, ASEAN, and Australia, but not many, actually, and I was quite surprised by that. I think, there's the typical ways that we can try and collaborate going forward, and the first one is to build those relationships based on trust and respect, and then move from there. So I would like to end there. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Susanna. If we can get the Slido questions up, and I've got a couple of questions just to kick us off, but please post your questions, any comments as well in Slido there, and we will get to as many of them as possible. But I've got a question for our panellists to kickstart us. There's a lot there, right? And there's a lot going on, not only in the countries that we've just been speaking about, but also globally. Jill's actually come back just recently from the conference, the platform conference there as well. So Australia's already, well connected globally, but particularly in the research space, we've already got researchers that have got good collaborations and same with NHRA, but they can always be better, right? And there's already opportunities and challenges. So I think if we can just touch base, each one of us, just touch on briefly, just what you see is some of the challenges, but also the opportunities that we can be taking as Australians, but also from a New Zealand and Singaporean perspective to foster a stronger international collaboration around science and evidence and sharing that for the good of safer, more sustainable communities.
Do you want me to start? Kia ora. Yeah, well, I guess we've kind of it's the sort of central theme in a way of the forum, and it's, I guess, the shared problems. So we're all trying to achieve similar things, head in the same direction, and it doesn't really make much sense to be duplicating effort in a research context. So where, it just seems so obvious that we should be working more closely together, and there'll be opportunities that come out of that dynamic in terms of new perspectives and things. So I think those shared resilience challenges really provide a context for bringing research teams together. In terms of the challenges, we heard the current uncertainty, geopolitical context, which is very significant, obviously. But if we assume there is some shared strategic direction, that we are all trying to achieve similar things in a disaster resilience context at least, then often it's the quite practical things. So aligning funding cycles, having money at the same time to get stuff happening, and that's where the partnerships can align those things. Thank you.
I think I'd probably agree with Richard. I think we do need to work more closely together. The funding cycles is a very good one. Certainly focus on the synergies, and there are a lot of them. That's been very evident but also the points of difference where we can find new ways to come together and new opportunities to research. For me, obviously, I do a lot of work in the cultural space, so I'm looking forward to working more closely with Natural Hazards Research Australia in that area. But the flip side of that coming together is the fact that there's been a lot of siloing for quite some time, and I think it's time we disrupt some of those silos. Yeah, that'll do for me.
Okay, I'm going to probably build on that. I think in terms of challenges to international collaboration, it's the three things for me. It's research funding, it's time, and it's the relationships. And we've touched on funding, which is linked to time. I think relationships take time as well. So building that respect and trust and essentially a research friendship takes a lot of time, and it needs to be funded top down, so giving us the time and the space in our research fields to go and meet people, but it also can be done bottom up. So trying to, co-supervise students, like small steps. So I think there's a two-pronged approach to facing those challenges or tackling them.
Right, we've got our first Slido question I'll go to, which I'll just summarise for everybody. It's really about the step change between our approach, which is more reactive around recovery-related response, as opposed to being upfront, investing in mitigation and reducing risk through good risk-based disaster risk reduction. So I suppose, what are you seeing globally in your context around the shift between, a model of recovery versus good proactive risk-based investment in DRR, and how science and evidence is better supporting that?
Okay, I think I was going to talk about the flip. So a little flip happened for Singapore after COVID, because COVID was a very big deal. We were locked down for a very long time, and it was very severe. We have an aging population, densely populated, it was at high risk. But what was amazing was that because we'd gone through SARS previously, everyone was actually quite well prepared. And I think that was a real sort of a proof of concept in a way. So we proved that by being prepared, we had a better response than I think we would have had otherwise had we not been prepared in that way. So I think that was a little bit of a turning point for Singapore, and there's a bit more money being put now into trying to future think and future proof, as it's called.
In a New Zealand context, I guess it would. My assessment would be that it's mixed in that the rhetoric and the strategy is very much focused on risk reduction, and it has been as part of the new framework came in about 20 years ago for comprehensive emergency management, as it was called then, but it has yet to translate into more concrete action around that focus. The focus is still very much on reactive approaches, response and recovery. We've got multiple recoveries underway in New Zealand currently, long tail still from the Canterbury earthquakes, impacts from COVID, etc. It's certainly a focus in a science context, so the collaborative multidisciplinary research program, that is the essence of the mission, essentially, is to get ahead of those issues, but it's the battle at the kind of political level around, costs avoided are, you can't cut a ribbon in front of avoided costs. So, that's kind of remains one of those sticking points, I guess, around the more integrated approach.
Cassie, I'll just change up the question here for you. There's a question here from Owen Price, which I'm going to slightly reword a little bit, because you spoke there about the barriers in terms of addressing the issues in the Maori community. Some of those about red tape, like I know people here in the room will be talking about the red tape that's involved around cultural burning here in Australia. Is there any red tape issues for Maori communities in Aotearoa?
Yes and no, because Māori communities don't wait, and I think that is probably true of a lot of Indigenous communities. They're used to living with adversity. In a lot of Indigenous languages, the word risk doesn't exist in my language. Te reo Māori, we have no word for risk. It is just is what it is. And so adaptive capacity, which is a word many here would be familiar with, is just something that we have been building for a very long time. If you look at, just quickly coming back to recovery too, my observation in the recovery space locally and globally, and wearing my policy hat, I've done a lot of work and been an author on the GAR, and that is that recovery is often the poor cousin. There's a lot of focus on it, and I think people forget and need to remember that recovery begins before the event, and we're seeing more recognition of that. The other thing is when we talk about losses, we need to make sure it's not just the economic losses, it's also the intangible losses, and there's growing recognition of that within the Santiago framework. And I think for those that have been locked in with COVID, some of the losses, the social losses, the relational losses that occurred makes people rethink. As for the Māori community, within some of those situations, they were responsible for shutting down Lifeline's infrastructure in order to protect communities. So, red tape examples would be things like, we can't allow Māori to have a voting role on our coordinating executive groups or groups because they're not frontline responders and they don't come with the right sort of resources to activate. Despite the fact that there's considerable financial, economic, social and cultural resources and built infrastructure that they will mobilise on the drop of a hat. So, is it official? Possibly not, but those are the sort of debates that go on.
Yeah. Now, extreme events came up in all the presentations in a lot of ways. Cassie, your slides on the Taranaki eruption really sort of illustrated that. Catherine Gearing's got a good question here about catastrophic planning. I think I best summarise this by saying perhaps firstly, what is some of the better practice around catastrophic planning that you're seeing in Asia and New Zealand, but also particularly for you, Cassie, there too, about the inclusion of First Nations knowledge in around planning for catastrophes as well. So, yeah, one for us all to talk to.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess it's an emerging discipline, and the National Agency is kind of finding its way in that regard. When I used to work for NEMA's predecessor as a science advisor, and we were never allowed to use the C word. or even the D word, disaster. It was only, we only ever had emergencies and we managed them. So I guess that there's a kind of a philosophical shift that has been happening. There's a recognition of really bad things happen and we're kind of confronting them. So yeah, I'm not sure if there are any NEMA New Zealand people in the room or online, so I wouldn't want to speak for them. Yeah, it's an evolving practice, and I guess learning what it means in terms of the uplift that's required in a planning context beyond kind of normal emergency planning. It's certainly bringing an interagency context to that. So it's bringing DPMC, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and other agencies, chief executives essentially, focused in that context. And that's probably it's lifted it out of the emergency management domain, essentially, I guess would be the summary in that regard.
From a Māori perspective, we've gone from one of the lead individuals in the Canterbury earthquakes having to take 8 days to even get in the door of the bunker in Canterbury and having to do it remotely through someone else, to, with the recent Cyclone Gabriel, NEMA Direct actually beginning to engage directly with the Iwi Leaders Forum. That's a quantum shift, and from an Indigenous person's perspective, it's happened really, really quickly. We have a Māori Chief Executive of our National Emergency Management Agency, a Māori Deputy Chief Executive. They know who they are, they know where they come from, and they're aware of the capabilities that can be brought to bear. So we are seeing that change. That said, regionally it's very different. Some areas are exceptionally well organised, they operate really fluidly, they have really good relationships with the Māori actors that have got, can mobilise assets in the areas. Other regions have had a lot of turnover in staff at the local level, and those relationships, and I think you put it really well when you said relationships take time, go back to square one.
So from a Singaporean perspective, we're quite new to this field of natural hazard research. So, you know, the research centre is only, 17 years old. So that's been a fundamental shift for us in the last 20 years, that sort of realisation and trying to act on it. What I think, so I would say actually that in terms of catastrophic risks, I don't think we're considering all of them. I think probably most people aren't, but we're working our way towards it. What I do quite value is the consequence-based approach. So there's been a bit of work around, so for example, the Singapore Food Agency are horizon scanning, and they're saying, okay, what are our potentials for food shortages of more than X% in the next X years? And then they're identifying scenarios that can lead to that and assigning probabilities. It's very quantitative, but I think that consequence-based approach is probably a newcomer for Singapore, and I think that's a really valuable way of doing things.
Great. So this is the time that I call speed questions. So we've got a couple of questions to get through that are quite popular here still. So I'm going to ask for short answers. So the first one here is really about insurance, right? So the question's reflecting on New Zealand having some level of regulatory intervention in the New Zealand insurance market. The question firstly goes to Singapore. Like, the Singapore market probably doesn't have to factor in a lot of natural hazards insurance, but do you want to just comment on that?
Quickly, yes. Yeah, exactly right. We don't directly address natural hazards in our insurance, but it's a very well looked after state. Most people live in something called the Housing Development Board, which is government provided housing for Singaporeans. So there is going to be a safety net. It's not that they don't have a safety net, they just don't specifically have an equivalent of the old EQC.
Great. Richard, did you want to talk about anything there?
Well, yeah, I guess it's the kind of the shifts that are happening now, and we're finding around affordability and availability of insurance. And so even with the underpinning government scheme, we're seeing that emerging as an issue for us. And it has risk transfer. Insurance has been a central part of our recovery plan as a nation, essentially. And we're now having to rethink that, because it's not, we're going to have to consider avoidance and control and acceptance as a more balanced mix, potentially.
Yep, similar here. Cassie, did you want to quickly...
Just a quick comment.
Yep.
Some of the things that are positives are that the New Zealand Insurance Council has actually looked at providing affordable insurance options for those that are in the lowest socioeconomic deciles, which is an exciting, but there are areas that are never going to be insured, even though they're a stable bedrock and low hazard risk. And some of those are cultural sites.
Yep. Susanna, a couple of questions here for you. Singapore Island State relies on a lot of infrastructure coming into Singapore. Anything Australia can learn from the context of the Singaporeans in terms of the resilience of that infrastructure?
Long-term thinking. So we were reliant on Malaysia for water, for 98% of our water, probably about 20 years ago, and the Singapore government said, right, let's stop that. We don't want to be reliant on another country for that because it's a dependency. And so they worked slowly and hard to fix it. So I think it's long-term thinking, not next 3-year thinking.
Yeah. A little bit of a question for everybody here around capability. So there's obviously emergency management organisations in each one of the nations that we're talking about. But what about organisations like think tanks, right? So we've got organisations in Australia like the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience, which really is an independent organisation which really plays that knowledge broker role between research and end users as well. Is there any organisations like that? Or, obviously, Richard, the platform is a little bit similar to NHRA in New Zealand, but who are some of the other organisations there leading the thinking?
I think we probably look with a little bit of jealousy to the kind of some of the structures and resources you have in that regard. Some of those functions are probably dispersed across agencies in an unclear way, and as you say, the research space probably steps in to fill some of that gap. I get one of the really positive approaches in New Zealand has been the application of a boundary organisation concept, so creating a space across the jurisdictional boundaries around an issue. This is the thing that drove the thinking around planning for an Alpine fault, major earthquake, for instance, with club funding and a bunch of agencies working together in a shared space. So that's, I guess, one initiative in a New Zealand context which has been successful.
Yeah, that Alpine 8 and also catastrophic planning engaged directly with some of the larger iwi, some of the larger tribes. So that was a really well organised set of projects.
Susanna?
I think similar to New Zealand, we're spread across places, but we are close together. So it's very easy to have those conversations, but nothing equivalent to AIDR, no.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a final question of all of you. Now, you've been here for a couple of days now. You have said good things. It's really nice for visitors to come and say nice things about what's going on in Australia. But if you were to be honest and you sort of said, okay, and I know that you haven't come in here and studied us brutally, but if there's something that you think that New Zealand and Singapore is doing really well that we could learn more about, what would it be? Susanna's prepared to go first.
Yes, at the risk of being stoned off the stage. No, I think regional cooperation and outwards thinking. So I think sometimes it's very easy to think about the fires burning at home and concentrate only on those fires burning at home without thinking that someone else might have a similar fire that they're tackling or a bigger fire that you can either help with or learn from. So I would say probably outwards thinking, and especially coming out of COVID, it's, we all became inwards thinking during COVID, but now it's time to open back out and appreciate and build the networks back up again, I think.
Great. Cassie, Richard, whoever wants to go first.
I'll start with a typically New Zealand self-deprecating comment that we're born to think everyone else is better than us, so it's very hard to make judgments on others. But I guess, and I haven't thought deeply around this in terms of the national arrangement, a lot of the things I'm seeing are really positive, especially the linkages that are happening in a research and agency space, but I guess it would probably building off Susanna's comment around the opportunity for deeper partnership in a regional context.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard.
Well, my father was born in Sydney, so I'm claiming to be half Australian today. But possibly the level of bureaucracy here is a little higher than what we face at home. The advantage of being small and knowing who the usual suspects are in the disaster research space enables speedy relationships. Here, it's a much more complex environment and much more complex political and lobby environment around everything from what grass shall we grow on an agricultural land. So, yeah, I don't need to go down that track. I think my point is made.
All good. Would you all join me in thanking our great panel this afternoon? So thank you to Susanna, Cassie, and Richard, and certainly from an NHRA perspective, we certainly look forward to our continued collaboration with you all, and thank you again. So just before I let you all go to drinks, I just want to give a bit of a shout out to our 7:30 a.m. panels and workshop sessions in the morning, because I just think it's just amazing the lineup for the workshop. So I'm just going to bring you to that part of the agenda. We've got some really good projects being showcased. We've got the work that we're doing with managing smoke impacts on firefighter eye health. We've got managing the risk of heat stress for first responders, multi-hazard resilient buildings, fire mosaics in landscape, fire planning, social media in community experiences. Now, I know the results and the findings of that. That's really, really interesting. So that's at 7:30. That's in this hall. So grab a coffee. We were here this morning. There was lots of people here. So if you weren't here, you missed out on the workshops this morning. And then there's one being run by me. So if the first one's not drawing you in, it will the one being run on assisted relocations community practice workshop. Certainly that will draw your attention, and we'll see you at that one at 7:30, if not at the others. And so drinks are now in where we were last night. Thank you again for all your efforts today, your collaborations. And sorry, Nicole, are you saying something? Oh, sorry, we're upstairs, not just out. We're upstairs. So thank you for the pointer. Sorry? Please use the ramp. Please use the ramp to get upstairs rather than the stairs. So thank you, everybody.